Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Munich is an ancient city with a history. It dates back to the 8th century AD. It was founded by monks whose monastery Skoflarn was located nearby. Today on the site of their first settlement stands the city's oldest church, St. Peter's Cathedral. If you climb up to the observation deck of its bell tower, you can feel it swaying quite perceptibly. Enterprising monks quickly invented to brew beer and sold it to the north, also improved the roads and charged a bounty from the salt traders of the Austrian Alps. The name Munich itself translates from Old German as by the monks. And the monk became the symbol of the city, but about that later. Like any old city, Munich has accumulated a lot of tales, myths and legends, which I'm going to tell you. Frauenkirche, Munich Devil's Footprint. The most famous urban legend concerns the symbol of the city, the Frauenkirche, the Cathedral of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It is the tallest building in the city center, 99 meters high, above which construction is simply forbidden, in the center. There used to be a chapel in its place, but a little girl was run over by the crowd during a service. Duke Sigismund, the ruler of these lands, was so saddened by the incident that he ordered a cathedral built to accommodate all comers. Erected as early as the late 14th century, in just 20 years, it was stunned by its size and power, and of course there were ugly rumors that the architect sold his soul to the devil. This is a very common belief in medieval folklore, which stuck almost any outstanding building, whether it be a bridge over the Danube in Regensburg or Neuschwanstein in Füssen. But here the situation is different, and a irrefutable clue remains. In the carousel above you will see a mark imprinted in the tiles. It is the mark of the enemy of man himself, Satan, Lucifer, the commander of the earth, the prince of this world himself. There is no consensus as to the circumstances under which the devil left this mark, so I will give here the most popular version. Architect Halsbach was extremely proud and very gifted. He regularly bragged about his projects. For example, he built a building and then had the center girder removed in front of a crowd. The building remained standing. In addition, being an educated man, he was more interested in churches as an architect than as a parishioner. This could not but attract the devil's attention, and he took the architect firmly by the balls. The devil insisted that the church be built without windows, or else on the day of the consecration he would send squalls of wind and bring the church right down on the heads of the first parishioners, for which Halsbach himself would then, of course, be executed. To avoid this fate, the architect agreed to make some infernal adjustments to the layout. They say that the devil wanted to leave the church without windows. On the day the building was handed over, he arrived at the site, entered through the main gate and stomped his foot with satisfaction before disappearing back into the underworld. From that position, indeed, no windows were visible. But the legend is misleading here, because you can see the main stained glass behind the altar and the side windows in the towers from there as well. So I think the changes were more global and blasphemous, namely that if you look at the cathedral from the sky, it looks like a huge phallus with eggs. There was no way the congregation could see that, so the spectacle was not for the people of the world, but for the inhabitants of the higher realms. The trail itself has now become a regular tourist attraction, but it's not all that simple. Sometimes the Frauenkirche closes for an invitation-only organ concert. This happens on Walpurgis night, from April 30th to May 1st. Where to get an invitation, no one knows. Everything happens very quietly, without much publicity. Outside you can really hear the organ parts of Bach and Messiaen, but you can't get inside. In the morning the cleaners often found drops of blood inside the devil's trail, and some of the organ's keys jam, which happens if you play a musical interval of 3 whole tones on the pneumatic organ several times in a row. Maiden Tower. The Maiden Tower, named after the torture tool Iron Maiden, was once part of the outer fortress wall. Only the base is left of the very impressive tower today, but it is the base that is interesting here. The point is that the tower was used as a torture chamber, and people of the Middle Ages, as we know, knew a lot about torture. In addition to the standard Spanish boots that crushed people's ankles, the rack on which the poor were stretched until their limbs went out of joint, the whips, molten iron masks, stocks, pincers, needles, and knives, here was a masterpiece of engineering hatred, the Iron Maiden. Essentially, it was just a coffin with sharp pins inside. The victim was locked inside, slowly closing the flaps until she confessed to any crimes or bled to death. But the most original thing about this torture tool was underneath. Hatch in the floor allowed immediate disposal of the corpse, which fell into a deep well leading to the foundation of the building. According to eyewitness accounts, not only could weeping and gnashing of teeth be heard near the tower, but the horrible stench from the many corpses decomposing at its base could also be felt. When the tower was demolished, several containers of bones were scooped out of the walls. It is not known how many bones remained in the tower's lower part, which was left untouched. There are still nasty rumors about the tower, from the strange sensations nearby to the ghost of Franz von Unertl, who appears every year on the anniversary of his execution, the night of January 6 to 7. The black tuxedo is drenched in blood, and the spirit's body is strewn with holes left by the maiden's blades. It is a documented fact that locals have repeatedly called the police because of the howling and moaning coming from the tower on winter nights. Whether the pranksters are to blame, or whether the wind has played a grim trick on the burghers, is unknown. The missing village at Berg am Laim. Munich also has its own version of Roanoke, the notorious American island where an entire English colony mysteriously disappeared. The village of Paschum once stood in the Berg am Laim district of Munich. The last mention of it dates back to the middle of the 14th century. The village suddenly disappeared, and in a rather eerie way. It was swallowed up by the earth's bowels. Local diocesan authorities considered the mysterious tragedy quite logical. Because heretics and godless lived in Paschum, there was not even a cross on the chapel. Subsequently, many witnesses claimed that in the area of the missing village, in windless, quiet weather, can be heard from under the ground creaking cartwheels and bell ringing. The new village, Baheim, built on the site of the missing one, did not survive on the cursed ground. It burned to the ground in 1504. Across from Bar 89 on Maximilianplatz stands the ancient Maxtor Gate, named after Elector Maximilian I. Walking through its central part is considered a bad omen, especially at night. Since the 19th century, there have been accounts of a haunting ghostly stalker from those who have walked there in the middle of the night. As the person who passed through the gate walked past the lanterns, he noticed that his shadow seemed to swell. And the farther one got away from the gate, the more the shadow swelled. One elderly lady swore she saw from her bedroom window a shadow the size of a house following a lonely girl and even obscuring the lanterns. It was said that this shadow should not be allowed to return home until daybreak, for once in the room, it would fill it entirely and at the same time consume its victim. Witch of Maximilianstrasse. This gloomy place is where Munich stores have exorbitant price tags: Rolex, Burberry, Dolce & Gabbana, and Louis Vuitton. The Falkenturm, the Falcon Tower, is another element of the cityscape where you would want to be the last place to be. It was across from the National Theatre, which was built 40 years before the damn place was demolished. In this tower, as in the Jungfernturm, torture and executions were carried out, but only for those who fell into the sinister realm of the Inquisition. Charges of witchcraft, sorcery, and Satanism were sent here to extract confessions from the accused by means of various instruments. The conditional witch could not be executed until a confession was obtained. According to legend, the last witch to be put here and executed was one Therese. She was accused by the innkeeper of giving blood instead of milk, and Therese herself was seen crawling on all fours around the cowshed. Therese endured a kaleidoscope of torture, but in the end, she confessed. The day before her execution, there was a howl and devilish laughter coming from her cell. The guards were wary of entering the cell until dawn. In the morning, Therese was found dead. The sacking she had been clothed in had disappeared without a trace. It was unexpectedly found on the innkeeper, who had used it as a noose. The owner was found hanged in the stable, on a beam. His cows, too, were dead and their intestines hung on the walls. The Olympic Stadium Ghost Station. For the 1972 Olympics, the same year that Israeli athletes were killed in a terrorist attack, the Germans prepared in earnest. Many buildings built for the Olympics are still studied as unique objects of architecture with unusual construction and unique design. The Olympic Village, the stadium, the park. But the holidays end, the circus leaves, and nobody needs these empty architectural monstrosities. Some of them are still in use, others are abandoned for lack of use. That's what happened with the Olympic Stadium station. Since there are almost no residential areas nearby and the Olympic venues are not very popular, the station was closed in 1988. However, no place is ever empty. And the ghost station became a haven for the homeless and the marginalized. What at first looked like a harmless derelict railway station had to be cleaned up with a dirty broom. Local gangs met here to settle accounts, youth bought drugs, and the neo-mustache men staged executions. Today, the Olympic Stadium is closed to the public, and trespassing is punishable by a fine. The Woman in Black at the Palace. Here, I think, no one will be surprised, because what is a palace without ghosts? This palace was first used by the electors, then passed into the ownership of the Wittelsbach dynasty. Despite the wealth and success in politics, the dynasty itself was considered almost cursed. Constant incest led to deep-rooted mental illnesses in the family, from which the men of the Wittelsbach family suffered particularly. The most famous victim of this genetic curse was Louis II. Unprivate, hovering in the clouds, he eventually lost the reins of power. He did not live long in his fairy tale castle in the Alps, and was found dead on the shores of the royal lake with his doctor. Meanwhile, at the residence, shortly before Louis' death, a woman in black was seen roaming the palace's corridors. She was scratching the portrait of the still-living monarch with her nails and weeping bitterly. It is not known whose shadow this was, but the family record even mentions her. She was seen in the palace each time shortly before the death of a member of the Wittelsbach family. The penultimate time she was spotted was the day before the death of Adalbert of Bavarian's son in 1969. The monarch had no time to warn him. His son crashed during a training flight. The ghost was last seen on April 23, 2014, by museum employee Margit Ilgner. She said that the gray translucent figure stood at the engraving depicting the Wittelsbach family tree and shook with sobs. Any doubt as to the figure's origin was removed by the fact that it was standing on the ceiling. Court of the Ramersdorf Church. Ramersdorf, once a small village and now a residential area, is 6 kilometers from the center of Munich. This unremarkable, quiet backwater village is famous because of the Ramersdorf bell. The Church of St. Mary in Ramersdorf has been rebuilt many times, most recently in the new millennium. But the effect of the midnight strike of the bell remains the same. As soon as it strikes 12, ghostly figures rise from the ground in the church cemetery. They are ordinary villagers, but one stands out among them. He is dirty, emaciated, covered in rags, chained. He is escorted on both sides by a priest and an executioner. Other ghosts shout evidence against him, a pagan guilty of child abduction, magical sacrifices, and other dark deeds. The priest reads out the verdict, followed by the executioner bowing the heathen's head to the scaffold. But as the executioner swings his axe over the condemned man's head, the pagan shouts some gibberish, either in Gallic or in Old Saxon, and the clock strikes 1 o'clock in the morning, and the vision melts away. Some folklorists who have studied this question have concluded that the words shouted by the pagan before his execution are translated as life in circles. The Phantom Lady in the Ebersberg Forest. Not far from Munich, the Ebersberg Forest is a wild place where deer, wild boars, and even bears still live in abundance. However, man is no stranger to this place either. One of the few man-made objects here is St. Hubert's Chapel, a small and inconspicuous chapel. Unlike the Max Gate, it poses no threat to pedestrians, but it poses a danger to motorists driving along this quiet road in the dark. Woe to those of them who see a woman voting by the side of the road and pick her up. Once inside, she reaches for the steering wheel, starts twisting it, grabs the gear lever, in general, provokes an accident in every possible way. Upon reaching its goal, the ghost disappears, leaving the wrecked car with the driver, well, if alive. Legend has it that once, in the 1940s, a man hit a woman who was voting in a car, got scared and dragged her into the woods and left her there to die. However, on German forums several times a message came up from a certain user who claimed that he was the grandson of that very driver. He assured me that his grandfather had deliberately run down the woman who had been voting by the roadside that night, because what appeared to be a woman was not human at all. Hangman's Tower on Sendlinger Tor. Sendlinger Tor is the old gate in the fortress wall that protected the city. Today only a few towers are left of it, but all 3 gates are still there. However, their appearance has undergone minor changes. These ones, for example, lost the famous Tower of the Executioner, or the Tower of the Fist. On the southern side of the gate was just the house of the Munich hangman. People of dirty work, they were not supposed to be neighbors with ordinary townspeople, so they lived on the outskirts, near the fortress wall. A small pointed tower as if to indicate the belonging of the house. That, however, under the influence of the elements and time, acquired a shape resembling a fist. There was a legend about it, as if a fist was painted crimson over an executioner whose conscience was impure. So the executioner was executing an innocent man. This, of course, is a fairy tale, but the true purpose of the tower is much scarier. The point is, it appeared before the hangman's house, and under some circumstances. Once upon a time, a greedy citizen negotiated a reward with a gang of burglars to let them into the town at night. The local authorities got wind of this, and in a rage they sentenced him to the worst death they could think of. They walled him up in a small tower at the gate to guard the town he was about to give up for desecration. The fist on top of the tower came later, when they decided to wall up the breathing hole, tired of the dying man's screams. Old South Cemetery. The Old South Cemetery, which in spring has a thick scent of ramson over it, has a dark history. Located near Blumenstrasse, formerly known as Executioner's Lane, the cemetery was the result of a terrible epidemic of bubonic plague, which claimed hundreds of lives daily. In 1563, the cemeteries near the churches were so overcrowded that the local duke issued a decree requiring the burial of plague corpses behind the wall. That's how this necropolis came to be. They are buried here mostly in mass graves, haphazardly, without tombstones, names, or crosses. Over time, the flow of corpses became so dense that the cemetery dug a tunnel under the wall, not to crowd the carts with the dead at the gate and not spread contagion. 150 years later, the Old South Cemetery was the site of an execution known as the Sendling Night of the Murders. The Reichswehr's army stabbed more than 1,000 peaceful Bavarian rebels who had opposed the Austrian regime here. Any attempted burials in this cemetery resulted in the exhumation of countless remains indiscriminately planted in the ground instead of digging a grave. During World War II, the cemetery was reminded of itself again. When bombs fell on its soil, human bones were blown far beyond the cemetery walls. Nockherberg. Well, what's a Munich legend without beer? The Nockherberg is a small beer terrace adjacent to the Paulaner Brewery. This is also the word for the festival of strong beer, which is held here during Lent. The Paulaner monks invented it all in 1651 to get through Lent without starving. They switched to the stronger liquid bread, also known as Salvator. It owes its name to Franz Sacherl, the poor son of a chef who managed to get into Parliament, buy out the brewery and break the Royal Brewery's monopoly on strong beer. After his death, however, the brewery's name was changed to Paulaner, and Sacherl's spirit was not slow to avenge it. In 1888, the Nockherberg festival turned into a real chaos. It began when a certain soldier had an argument with the local villagers. One thing led to another. The soldier drew his sword, and off they went. Soon everyone was fighting against everyone. Benches, sticks, stones, farm tools, and heavy clay cups were used. Many people were injured, and the fight was only quelled when 50 mounted gendarmes in heavy armor drove straight into the raging hall. They found the instigators, badly maimed, but alive, and listened to their versions. The soldier was court-martialed, where he swore on the record that he had no sword with him at all. Bull Cathedral. The magnificent 1925 Art Nouveau three-nave building was abandoned only a couple of decades ago. Looking from the outside, you wouldn't think it was a former slaughterhouse. The Bovine Cathedral, as the locals call it, is located in the municipality of Bad Kissingen, almost 300 kilometers north of Munich. However, despite such a remote location, it would be unfair to ignore it. The history of the massacre is not replete with tragic or mystical events. It is too prosaic. 20 cows, 40 pigs, and 120 heads of small ruminants were slaughtered there every day. Every day, 364 days a year, with the exception of Christmas. And so for 77 years without interruption, all that time the blood of the slaughtered animals, through gutters and pipes, flowed into the river. Today, the bullring is shut down because it does not meet the new sterility standards in the EU. While the building is vacant, you can get in here with the appropriate permission from the local municipality as a photographer or journalist. They say that if you stand in the center of the long, 50-meter-high hall with 16-meter-high ceilings and listen closely, you can pick up the mournful mooing, howling, roaring, cacophony of chugging, smacking, and other sounds that accompany murder and dismemberment. In addition, locals sometimes complain that the river water beneath the gutters of the slaughterhouse is stained red from time to time. Perhaps the jokers with food dyes are to blame, though. The Plague Chapel. And now we have reached the most cursed place in all of Bavaria. There isn't much information about it in official sources, but there's an abundance of rumors, some of which are well documented. Paulingsrud Chapel, Aka Walheim's Plague Chapel, is located deep in the forests of Lauterbach, near the village of Eichendorf, 100 kilometers from Munich. The very name Paulingsrud belonged to the settlement, which fell into disrepair and was demolished to the ground by the Bavarian government. Already suggestive, isn't it? Originally, on the site of the present chapel stood a wooden church in the name of St. George, built, in turn, on the site of a Celtic temple. It was first mentioned in 1162 and most recently in 1655, when locals gathered for Mass in honor of Sebastianstag, the day dedicated to the saint who helped fight disease and oversee wells. The plague was raging in Bavaria at the time, and medieval man's only salvation was considered prayers and the timely disposal of corpses. So, during another service, under unclear circumstances, the church burned down, several parishioners were injured, the tunnels of the crypt were blocked, and the bodies of those who tried to escape from the fire were buried in them. In 1666, the present Plague Chapel was erected on the site of the church, in honor of the victory over the pestilence. Since then, it has been restored and rebuilt several times, until the settlement of Paulingsrud at the end of the 18th century, and so the chapel has survived to this day. Inside you can see an altar stone lying there from the Celtic era, and the numerous tunnels of the crypt still pierce the earth strata, just as they did in the time of the plague. Today the chapel is of particular interest to all sorts of occultists and Satanists of all sorts, so its doors are locked, and there are alarms and video surveillance inside. There is certainly much to see here. Concentric stone circles grow out of the ground in the clearing in front of the chapel, and in the nearby forest you can find 5 wells left over from the old wooden church. Rather, so far only 4 have been discovered, but rumor has it that there is a 5th, as they call it the Devil's Well, and that it, together with the others, forms a pentagram. There are also reports that some of the wells were used by the locals to dispose of plague corpses, with which they threw the still living infected into the well. It is said that the water in the wells still reeks of rottenness. Finding this chapel is already a kind of adventure. It is said that the dead Paulingsrid, overgrown with woods, circles travelers, plays with them, and puts paths under their feet that lead to a dead end. There is a theory that one must walk through the forest as if the village still exists, with all the fences, barns, and houses, then you will reach the goal. They also say that people with a pure heart can show the way to the chapel and back, which is even more important, a very strange guide, a black dog. This beast won't come within 10 yards of anyone, no matter how much you bait him. There are also stories of a woman hanging from a limb who follows you and hangs from almost every tree you look at. However, all the paths of the Paulingsrid forest will eventually lead you to the chapel. Now, you have to wait until nightfall to touch the supernatural. Locals assure you that after midnight the candles are lit in the church, the cross over the altar is overturned, and a tall figure with a red collar and bulging eyes walks among the few pews, which you should not look into. Of course, it all sounds like fables, a trap for tourists. However, they are based on a very real story. In 1625, a local pastor, for some unknown reason, killed a girl and threw her body down a well. Her dog, a large black mastiff, came running at the smell and stood over the well for days until the pastor came nearby and wanted to drive away the unexpected witness. The dog tore the pastor's throat and did not unhinge his jaws until he died. The villagers had to slaughter it to free the servant of the Lord. He repented before he died and made a confession, which has been recorded and preserved to this day.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.